Hey guys, so I've got a game to share which illustrates the difference in value between pawns and pieces. I think a lot of people when they're starting out in chess we get stuck in our head that a knight's always worth 3, a bishop's worth 3, a rook's worth 5, a pawn's worth 1, etc. But what you need to bear in mind is the amount of influence on the game that each piece may have. So let me take you through this example because I think it's interesting. Now, this is not a perfect game. It's pretty scrappy, but I definitely I think I make a good call in this. So see what you think. Anyway, so I'm playing with the white pieces. My opponent's rated 1339, and we have a Sicilian, and I play the Snyder with the bishop on b2. Bishop out, queen out. So obviously the queen's threatening mate in 1 here. So the knight blocks that. Develop my knight. Knight comes around to hassle my bishop, and I put my bishop in here in the center where it can't be disturbed by any of these pawns. Black captures and knight recaptures. Now I've got a knight in this nice outpost because there's no pawns that can now get to these squares to disturb my knight. And probably c4 will come and solidify its position in there. So bishop comes out again to attack the knight, and then c4. Knight comes back round. I develop my final knight, getting ready to castle. Knight comes back round again to e7. Okay. And now we have a kind of a key moment. Do you capture with c4 or do you capture with e4? What would you do in this situation? But in the end, I decided to capture with the e-pawn, although capturing with c would have given me 2 central pawns. I figured that actually, seeing as my opponent's king is uncastled at this point, I might be able to get a rook there, move my knight. If bishop comes out, I've always got ideas of attacking this pawn with my queen and stuff like that. So I just thought it was better to have that open file. Or semi-open file, seeing as my opponent is not castled. Okay, so now he moves his bishop back to there. Okay, I move across to prevent this move. Okay, so this is a yin move. I'm preventing my opponent's ideas rather than just pushing ahead with my own. Queen comes out. I put my rook on the semi-open file. It seems to be a sensible move. Obviously, this pawn is now pinned. Okay, pinned on the queen. Bishop here, and now knight to f4. Okay, the pawn is still pinned, so the pawn can't capture or the queen will fall. All right, so queen moves across. You see these bishops that are in bad positions again. Like I did a video on this yesterday about positioning. Their firing lines are going off the sides of the board. Bishops are much stronger when they're towards the corner, particularly the opposite corner to your opponent's king. So I'm not sweating too much about these bishops at this point in time. Now I maneuver my knight round, maybe got ideas of lifting my rook, trying to attack. However, these bishops are actually controlling a lot of squares, it has to be said. So they're doing quite a decent job at keeping me out of the kingside attack. So at this point, black also castles short, and now key decision. So having moved my knight here, I figured that okay, my knight can't go there, can't go there, can't go there, can't go there. It's got no forward moves. Okay, and I'm also thinking that I don't have a pawn on the e-file, only my opponent has a pawn on the e-file. Okay, so what I decided at this point, and the computer hates this move, the computer actually calls this a mistake, but I decided to capture the pawn on e5 with my knight. Okay, pawn recaptures, bishop recaptures. Okay, so I've exchanged my knight for 2 pawns, and now mathematically that's inferior because a knight is worth 3 and a pawn is worth 2. However, I've now got a lovely passed pawn on here, right? I mean, I guess I always did, but you know, see how the game develops, because my pawns actually become very strong. And in fact, really, the theme of this game is the importance of pawns. Okay, so we've got bishop to f6, kind of pinning my bishop, but it's defended by queen and rook. So I counterattack. I move my bishop to with a counterattack on the queen. Okay, so next I can move my rook and I'm safe. So that's one way of getting out of a pin. Okay, so we have queen to g6, and I decide to swap off queens, doubling my opponent's pawns. Okay, so with this move now, my opponent has no pawns on the e file, no pawns on the f file. Okay, and now rook d1, bishop out here, and another crucial turning point. I play my bishop back to e3. So obviously threatening this, if pawn recaptures, it'll be isolated on the d file. It's going to be tough to defend, particularly seeing as there'll be no dark squared bishop. And my opponent here decides to exchange. I now recapture with my d pawn, so I've undoubled these pawns that I had on the d file, but also notice now I've got all 8 pawns on the board. I don't think I've ever finished a game with all 8 pawns. I probably have in some ridiculous checkmate or something like that, but okay. And now look at this, wonderful. So this pawn now has a pretty clear run, and I've got rooks supporting both of these pawns. The rook comes across to b8 for no reason whatsoever. Now f3 is supporting e4. Okay, so that's the reason for this. So what black's thinking is capture there. If pawn captures, maybe drop the rook down, something like that. So what I actually do is I decide to pull my rook back to c1. Pawn takes, now I recapture with the rook. So this rook now cannot get down this file, and I'm threatening this pawn. Okay, so the rook now slides across to defend the pawn, and now I'm pushing with my pawns. Okay, we have g5, now e5, and I'm threatening to come in here and dislodge the bishop. Bishop comes back with an attack on my rook, and I bring my rook now here behind the e pawn. Now these pawns are becoming monstrous. Okay, I'm unconcerned about the a pawn here. That's not a problem. So I push this d pawn. Now, and here the thing you really got to appreciate as well is how much more powerful a pair of pawns on adjacent files is than any single pawn. And this becomes now really quite treacherous for black. And if you visualize what can happen here, I mean, so let's say I push a pawn, it's attacking the rook, rook might move to there, and then bang, the other pawn comes in. I'm attacking both rooks, and it's simply winning. My opponent here thinks for nearly 3 minutes, and then makes exactly the right move. So what is the move that my opponent played? Next, what would you do here? Feel free to pause and have a think. So the move that black plays now is bishop takes e6. So he now sacrifices his own bishop for one pawn here, but it's absolutely critical. The game would be lost if he didn't sack his bishop here, right? So now we've got a situation where after I recapture, material is technically equal, right? But see how it unwinds. So material's equal, right? I've got 3 pawns tight around my king. Black's got this one right on the edge, which could be quite dangerous. I've got one that's very near to promotion, but the other issue is that black has these doubled pawns on the g file as well, and that's always going to be a bit harder to defend and attack with when you've got double pawns. So we have rook challenges the pawn, rook defends the pawn, rook comes up as a second attacker. So we've got a bit of a stalemate here. Well, it's not a stalemate, but you know, it's a bit of a face-off. And now I think black, so yeah, I move my king to f2, and now black does the same thing, but in this case it's a blunder. So what I'm trying to do is I want to bring my king up and start attacking pawns. You want to attack in a couple of different areas if you can. Okay, black now plays this, and this I think is a big mistake, because it allows me to break the deadlock on this pawn with rook e7 check, and a fork on both the king and that one potentially dangerous pawn. King moves, I remove the dangerous pawn. I'm not concerned now about d6. I think that snatching that pawn off, and now what I need to do is convert this very slender advantage, okay, of my 3 undoubled pawns against black's 3 pawns that do happen to be doubled. And I don't think my opponent finishes terribly well with this. So rook across, and now this is actually a blunder. This is an absolute blunder. Can you see why? Okay, it's a standard tactic, and the tactic is called deflecting the defender. Okay, because right now I've got a rook looking at this pawn on g7. Right, the only defender of that pawn is this king. But if I capture this rook, king recaptures, pawn falls. Okay, so now I'm a full pawn up, and pawns matter. This is the thing, pawns matter. Now I'm obviously, this is also comes with a fork. I'm attacking both pawns. So he pushes a pawn to defend, but I just drop my rook to g6, and it's another fork. So I'm now 2 pawns up. King down to there, king g3 goes to safety, rook across. I slide my rook right over to the other side of the board. I wasn't concerned. The rook can't come in here, and obviously it can't come to here because pawn would just take. So rook moves, I deliver check, and a few more moves. So now I propose a trade of rooks, which should be pretty easy. That would move my pawn to here. So I've got the 2-on-1 here, and I'd have a pawn on there as well. Black, I think rightly, refuses the trade, and now h4, and we don't exchange pawns, but the king moves in there. I capture, rook captures, king f2, and the final move, rook to f5, is another blunder, because now g4 with check and also forking the rook, and my opponent resigns at that point. The game is lost. So what I'm trying to get across and communicate with this example is don't treat pawns as though they are worthless. You know, in many ways pawns can be the most powerful pieces on the board. Pawns win an awful lot of games, right? If a pawn threatens to promote or promotes, suddenly, you know, it's like the closer it gets to that line, the more valuable it becomes. So it's never, you know, these pawns that I had in the middle of the board, if I go back to here, right, this situation, these pawns aren't worth 1 point, right? As far as my opponent is concerned, and quite rightly, it was worth at least 3. Okay, he's willing to trade his long-range piece, his bishop, to get rid of these pawns. Okay, so you need to treat the idea of piece value as a loose and movable thing. That's the key thing, you know. So we had this, and the computer confirms that's the correct move. Then with this, I'm quite happy to remove this pawn on a7, which hasn't even moved once during the game, right? In return for this one, which is only 2 steps away from promotion, right? But it's important because chess is about winning the game. Okay, so how was I've got no way of protecting this pawn really anyway, but I removed this one because that is really black's best shot at winning the chess game. Okay, so we swap them off, and then yeah, my opponent blunders, and I go on to win relatively comfortably. So that's it. So, you know, if you are stuck with this idea that a knight is worth 3, a bishop is worth 3, a pawn is worth 1, etc., just say, okay, now you know, part of growing into a stronger player is going to be to modify and start to be more flexible in that thinking. Okay, so that's it. That's what I wanted to share in this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed. I'll see you soon.